We had talked about a lot about the body and about the breath, using the breath, for our object of meditation, focusing on the breath or concentrating on the breath, using it to still the mind, calm the body. And we talked about how to use the breath to, bring energy into the body and to also calm the body as well. That these techniques work for a lot of people. They don't work for everybody. So I know a lot of people have different methods and stuff. The drowsiness seems to be a big thing for a lot of people. Different times of the day. Usually the mid-afternoon kind of thing. After lunch. And I think we find the same thing when we're at work, when we're actually in life, around 2 or 3 o'clock, the body starts shutting down for a while, and then we pick up again. So it's just impermanent kind of a drowsy state that we go through. And if it's a state, it is impermanent. I'll guarantee it, because all states are. And then we talked about feelings yesterday and then into today as well. Positive, negative, and then the neutral feelings. And I hope you were kind of moving through the day, with these things in mind. And I kind of related it to moving through life or moving through our day by instinct, intuition, and just relinquishing the garbage that we carry with us, the stories of the past and the future, and really how these feelings can conjure up a lot of thoughts. Thoughts can conjure up, kind of sustain the feelings. If we see something that we don't like and we keep thinking about it, I think we can all understand how it can keep coming up for us. So the feelings are related to the senses, sense perception. We perceive something and there's a feeling that comes up. Nothing we can do about it. It comes up. All we can do is be aware. And so when there's contact, there's a feeling that arises. After that feeling, if there isn't some kind of awareness, there's going to be grasping or clinging. There can be. Either clinging to our view, our idea of it, or actually clinging onto that object, thinking that this thing is going to provide happiness for me. And feelings are very, very short-lived. They're just, I'm going to do it again. They rise and fall. And so to understand feelings is very, very beneficial. And I'm sure all of us understand it on an intellectual basis, but we have to, to remember it, to remember how feelings work. It's really a wedge of awareness between the feeling and that clinging, that grasping. It's just getting an upper hand on it, just realizing, being aware of it. Sounds basic, doesn't it? And then, if you remember, I'm following suit with the Anapanasati. This is one of the books that I wrote. It's based completely on the Anapanasati, and my take on it, my definition on it. Anapanasati is Mindfulness of Breathing Sutta from the Buddha, and the first two areas are body, feelings, and then the third area is states, or mind states, or we could say states of mind. I often think of, Billy Joel, New York State of Mind, where he said, what did he say about that? Anyway, he was in a New York state of mind. I mean, I don't know what that, Buddha didn't mention the New York state of mind, but there's any number of states that we can have. So rather than referring to I feel sleepy, or I feel happy, I feel sad, I feel desirous, I feel greedy, I feel fearful, I feel all these things. It's not a feeling in Buddhism, because the terminologies will get turned around. It's a state. And there's a state present all of the time. Right now we have a state. We're experiencing a state. And we probably didn't even consider that until I said we're experiencing a state right now. But it's as simple as that. To get an upper hand on a state is just to ask ourselves, what state am I experiencing at this time? It's usually, how do I feel? but we can't. And now that we know the terminology, the Buddhist terminology, we can't use that. We have to look at it as state. And the three primary states that the Buddha talked about a lot are related to the hindrances. It's greed, hatred, and delusion. We've probably all heard that or read it if we've read any kind of Buddhist books or anything like that. This greed, hatred, and delusion are the primary mind states that we have. Greed is the desirous things that we want. The sticky things, and they can stem from our feelings, pleasant feelings towards something. If we find something pleasant, we want more of it generally, unless we are aware. And then the hatred part is really the aversion. So we got greed, hatred, and delusion. Hatred is the pushing away, and it could be fear as well. Any kind of a state that we don't want to deal with, or just we want it out of the way. We don't want any more of it. Just get out of here. And then delusion is the mind that isn't very well informed. It could be worrisome. It could be that restlessness. It could be just the mind that is just confused. It happens a lot, where we don't quite understand something, so we can't rest, we can't settle. The mind is just trying to figuring it out. So it's not necessarily a desire or an aversion. It's not a pulling or a pushing. It's just a confusion of the mind. And these are the three primary states that the Buddha talked about a lot, plus their opposites. And generosity is the opposite of greed. And loving kindness, or metta, is the opposite of hatred. And then the opposite of delusion is wisdom. And those are the results of this greed, hatred, and delusion not being a part of us, not being a part of any of our states. So in other words, so it's much better to have the generosity and the loving kindness and the wisdom rather than greed, hatred, and delusion. I think we'd all agree with that. So again, if we just ask ourselves what kind of state we're experiencing at any given moment, we really see the power of awareness, because as soon as we identify that state, it changes immediately. And we can, if we reflect a little bit back, if there was a time when we were doing something that we were angry or something like that, and all of a sudden somebody chimed in and said, what are you angry about? All of a sudden, there's a shift. Even a subtle shift can happen. Usually it's you darn right I'm angry. So and so did this, and then you start talking it out, and immediately everything is changing. But when we can do that ourselves by just identifying, being aware of our mind states. We just say, I'm very angry at that car that just cut me off, for example. And when we see that anger for what it is, it changes. But when we do that consistently, we really see the reality of what is happening, and it's just a state, a very, very impermanent arising of something that came about from causes and conditions. That's the reality of what's happening. Things and situations come together, and there's a state that arises. It could be from a feeling, a pleasant or unpleasant thing, or it could be something that just completely takes us by surprise. In other words, fear. Fear can come up by a loud noise. From something like that happening, there's fear. But when we identify what made the noise and identify that it was just fear, it's gone. We usually, I was scared. That kind of thing. So identifying these states and looking at them, I think it's just incredibly beautiful how the Buddha divided these things up. We have this body that we worked with quite a bit this weekend. We have feelings that we looked at, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and then we're looking at these states. How these, actually, we can look at them as moods and emotions that we have, and that we can identify them, just that simple. And a lot of times when I'm working with a group of people that are talking, not in a silent retreat, we'll go around the room and say, identify, have each person identify their state, what state they're sharing, and that they're experiencing. And it's interesting. And then by the end of the class, we'll go around again, and it'll be completely different state. But in reality, it changes very quick. But the main thing is that if we understand these states with the assumption that I'm going to change the state to a better state, and then we start running into trouble. Anything from seeking and searching to addictions. That's what causes the addictions that we have, because people are seeking a different state in a very subtle way. When somebody that comes home from work and grabs something out of the refrigerator and sits on the couch and flips on the TV, they're looking for a different state. And they're finding it too. It's pretty immediate, because they're doing this habitual thing that is bringing about that state. And if it doesn't work, they get mad. The wrong station's on TV or something, or they can't find the remote or something. Things just aren't working the way they're supposed to, or the chocolate ice, the dog ate the chocolate ice cream, or something like that. The state isn't that easy to get into. Something's missing. So one gets upset about that. And particularly in meditation, if we're meditating for the purpose to get into another state, that's just as dangerous. But don't get me wrong, the states are changing all the time. If we go into meditation, there's going to be different states coming up, and our job as a meditator is just to observe these things as they come up. Everything is born and dies. Everything has a life, and feelings and states are the same way. Just like a tree or a person or a day or a week or a year, everything rises and falls. Birth and death. It's completely impermanent. So the states are are important to understand. Whenever I talk about states, the word inner state always comes up. I don't know why. Lately, anyway. I think it's a good word. Just, to remove it from the inner states that we talk about, but we're talking about the inner state, like the roadmap of the person, the states that we have. Might be a good name for a book. The improvement of our inner states. All sorts of people might buy that. And then they'd go to the store and buy it and realize it's not about infrastructure. It's about Buddha Dharma. What is that, So the next area, if we had more time, we would talk about states a little bit more. And generally, if we're doing one of my 8-week courses, we'd spend a week on it, or actually 2 weeks. But here we're just going to spend about 15 minutes, and then we're going to move on to the next area of the Anapanasati, which is the Dharmas. And the Dharmas are often referred to as the Buddhist teachings. Bodhidasa Bhikkhu, a Thai monk that I have, who passed away, about 15 years ago, I think now, who I have a lot of respect for, has a lot of books that he has written, and most of the books were just from his discourses. He spent he spent all of his life in Thailand. He didn't speak any other language. But his definition of Dharma, or Dharma is the Sanskrit name, and in the Pali word is Dhamma. But it's often, like I said, it's often referred to as teachings, particularly the Buddhist teachings. But I have to read this because I want to get it right. I don't want to misquote. But I copied it and put it in the book here. The definition by the late Thai monk Buddhidasa Bhikkhu defines Dharma or Dhamma as nature, the law and truth of nature, the duty to be performed in accordance with nature, and the results or benefits that arise from the performance of that duty. I'm just going to go on and read a little bit more here. Nature is always and will always be our best teacher. The Buddhist teachings have borrowed from this. The noticing of how life and everything in it is a continuous rising and falling away, and how it can be seen as a continual series of birth and death is nature being nature. It is reality. A little bit more. If nature and its effect are seen and realized beyond the mere intellectual understanding, an experiential understanding that can be witnessed through insight can have a life-altering effect. But yet we seem to try to separate ourselves from nature, perhaps because we think of it as in some way being a barbaric lesson in life and death. In other words, in nature, and I kind of referred to this the other day, that when we walk through the forest, we see live trees and we see dead trees. There's just as much death on the forest floor, or what we refer to as death on the forest floor, as there is life. Branches and trees and debris. But that's a part of sustaining the woods, sustaining the forest. It turns into mulch, which is fertilizer for everything else that is going to be growing. So it's a series of life and death, or birth and dying. And all of our lessons can come from, I believe anyway, and all of our lessons can come from nature. And I mentioned that earlier too. That if we can just see things, see the truth and the reality of what is happening, beyond the cognition and beyond the way we want or think things should be, or the way we learn things should be, we see things as just the ultimate truth. And that being that everything is impermanent and completely selfless. In the Anapanasati, there's I mentioned the body, feelings, mind state, and the dhammas. And each one of these areas, they call them, has a tetrad, because each four of these parts has four sections added to it. I don't want to go through all those right now. It just sounds kind of confusing, I'm sure. But with the dhammas, there's four areas that the Buddha talked about in this discourse. And the very first one was impermanence. And this is usually one of the first insights that comes up for people. And we can generally understand impermanence on an intellectual basis. And most of us have heard the term about impermanence, and that everything is in a constant flux or a constant change. And when we look at stuff, we can realize that. And I have referred to, and I'll say it again, that if we had something that was never going to change, it would be the most valuable thing in the world. Because everything is changing. Everything is constantly changing. It might be on a microscopic level, but even if you take a diamond for an example, what we refer to as the hardest substance in the world, isn't it? Is it still the hardest substance? There might be some man-made material that's harder, I don't know, but the diamond is supposed to be the hardest substance in the world, but if you look at it microscopically, it's deteriorating very, very slowly, but it's still changing. But what is even changing faster is our opinion or our view of that diamond. And our view of everything is changing constantly. Every time we look at something, every time we look at these percussion instruments, our view of them is different. We're seeing something different. We're maybe seeing, things are changing all the time from our standpoint, and they're changing from their standpoint too. That leather, hard for us to see, but the leather on some of these drums that have real leather has probably changed significantly since we first saw them laying there. Just for an example, we could look at anything and see that, but for the most part, it's beyond our comprehension and beyond our seeing how everything is changing. But I think we can all agree that everything is changing. But the important aspect of change and impermanence is that the next step in this Anapanasati, impermanence, is fading away. It's called fading away, and that's in the discourse. The Buddha was talking about our fading away of our attachment, because if we realize that everything is impermanent, that there's no reason to attach on to anything. Why would there be? If we find something that we like, we know it's going to change. And we're going to change too. So why should we have to, if we fully, truthfully understand impermanence, why would we have to grasp on to anything, attach on to anything, and actually call something ours? How can we own something? Greg and I were talking in the other room there. Legally, it was an interview. It wasn't illegally. But we were talking about when the white man came over to the United States and told the Indians that they want to buy their land. We'd like to buy that piece of land there. The Indians, they didn't understand the concept. You can't buy land. It's there. It's just there. It's for everybody. There's no ownership. There's no way you can buy something that can't be owned. And of course, the white man loved that, and they took advantage of it. in a big, big way. Otherwise we'd be sitting in no man's land right here, It's a good term, no man's land. It just doesn't exist anymore. So the concept of ownership is really a construct of the mind. It seems like we can own things, and then when we die, might have our name on it. It's got a label on it, so our relatives can say, "Oh, now I own it." Probably cause a big legal battle anyway, but now your relatives own it, and they can put their label on it, and then when they die, they can pass this thing on to maybe their relatives, whatever this thing is, and it's greatly, greatly changed. It's probably no value to it at all anyway. I think you all know where I'm coming from on this, that things do change, and with it's actually called fading away of our attachment and of our hanging on or clinging. The third area of this Dharma teaching, and the reason I should interject, the reason I'm saying this is because this last part of the Anapanasati, rather than focusing on the rising of feelings and the rising of mind states, the awareness of them in meditation, and then coming back to the breath, and this area of the Anapanasati is actually contemplation. He taught it as a contemplation, that we penetrate these things and see them for what they are. And he mentioned that they're insights that arise for us when we're meditating. Insights of impermanence, insights of fading away. And then the next one is contemplating cessation, the ending of suffering. So when we see everything as impermanent and changing, we lose our clinging and our grasping onto it. Our suffering stops, and that's the suffering that he had been talking about since his first teaching. The Four Noble Truths. That we stop trying to own, trying to control. Basically, that's the secret word right there, is trying to control things and have things to be our own. Then the suffering that is related to that is no longer. Just how would our life be if we didn't have to identify as being the owner of this or that, or to protect this or that? And to say, this is mine, you can't have it. This is my my family, my country. How many wars have we had because we feel like we want to control this piece of land, but this other people want to control it, as well. I spent some time in China, and I asked a lot of people that spoke English in China, I asked them about the Tibetan situation, because we were right by the border there. And the Chinese people said that Tibet was always ours. They said that it was never owned by the Tibetans, it was always part of China. Every person that I asked, the Chinese people. So that's what they felt, that they had control over that land. And of course the Tibetans said that, we've lived here all of our lives, what do you mean? But, so all of a sudden there's a conflict. These people want to control the land, and the Tibetans, of course, want to keep controlling it. And of course we have that problem happening. So impermanence, fading away, cessation of suffering, and then the final area of the Anapanasati, the final area of the Dharma contemplation as well, is relinquishment. And that's a understanding that everything that we've ever had, everything that we've ever thought or thought of or thought we had, ownership or all of that has to be given back to where it came. Everything. So nature, again, the teaching is in nature. Nature has a way of reclaiming everything. If we didn't paint our houses, especially in an area like this, in a forest, where there's moisture and stuff. Actually, anywhere, if we didn't keep up a house, it's amazing how fast it deteriorates and would crumble away into ashes, and it would be a part of the earth again. Just like all the trees in the woods, they fall and they deteriorate and they're fertilizer. A building like this could easily be fertilizer. It's a lot of fertilizer, but it could be a lot of mulch, right? Or a whole city. But we can't stop there. We have to look at ourselves. We have to look at, this vehicle right here, this body of ours. So it's as if this is borrowed, and then it's everything. Remember, everything is born and dies. So there's a beginning and ending, So we have this body, and then when we're done with it actually, if we were living in nature, really living in nature, it would be buried in the ground, and it would literally be fertilizer, rather than encased in a box, and then becoming fertilizer, a couple hundred years later. Or like in the many other countries, would just burn into ashes, and then another type of fertilizer, really, And it's all stems from, these are all insights that we have from a clarity of mind that can be brought about by meditation. That everything is impermanent, and that there's a fading away of this attachment, this grasping, and then the cessation of suffering that is related to that, and actually the liberation, that knowing that everything has to be given back. There's no ownership. In other words, there's no self to even control or have any of these things. That's what Buddha's big, most important teaching was. That's what he spent his whole career, you could say, as a teacher, trying to get across, that there is no self behind any of this. But it's a liberation. It's a complete liberation for us to understand that. Because we realize that we don't have to identify with every little thing that comes up in the mind. We don't have to identify with owning this or controlling that, or setting ourselves up for suffering by saying, this is my relationship, this is how it's going to stay, or this is my house, and I like it, and it's going to stay exactly like this. I don't have to fix it up or anything. And on and on and on, and with everything that we have. And again, it's important to remember that these are, the Buddha talked of these as insights, and most of Buddha's teachings were, when we really look into them, we see them as insights that he had. Insights that arise through meditation, not from the cognitive aspect of thinking and trying to figure things out, but from just letting go and resting, stilling the mind, and then the insight arises. And then once the insight arises, we just look at it, we penetrate it, just like day before yesterday when we did that open eye kind of practice where I said stare at something and really look at it. And after a while, looking, we related it to concentration, but after a while, looking becomes very easy. Our eyes don't water, we don't blink, we just look, and that's how it is in contemplation. Contemplation is taking something and isolating it to a point where we just penetrate it with the mind, not necessarily bearing down on it, but just resting on it and looking at it constantly, very easily. So whether anybody realizes it or not, we went through the Anapanasati. We went through the book. So.